Well, when you look at the kind of input Musk has been having into politics, there has been some polling done which suggests there is a strong dissatisfaction with.
They didn't believe Canada would make up her mind. They laughed at its threats, ignoring warnings for years and continuing to press on with tariffs. But now things have changed. $103 billion. That's how much the US economy is losing after its main energy partner, Canada, cut off its oil and gas supply. No notice, no negotiation. Just turned off the faucet. It's more than an economic blow. It's a slap in the face. And it was delivered right in the heart, at a time when the US was least prepared for it.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
While Washington was wasting time in disputes and sanctions, Canada was signing contracts with China and India for decades to come. Now the flow of Canadian oil and gas no longer goes to Houston or Detroit. It goes to Shanghai, Mumbai and Rotterdam. For the US, it's not just a loss of fuel, it's a loss of control, a loss of influence, a loss of status. Gasoline prices, electricity prices, grocery prices, everything is ripped upward. California is already talking about rolling blackouts. New York is preparing for blackouts. Production lines at auto and steel plants are shutting down. Businesses are slashing budgets, laying people off. America is entering an energy winter not seen since the 1970s.
They're doing what they should be doing, perhaps, for the European Union, but it does create ill will. And as you know, we're going to be doing reciprocal tariffs. So whatever they charge us, we're charging them.
And in the White House, it's chaos. Donald Trump is throwing a tantrum right in the Oval Office, screaming about 100% tariffs on Canadian cars, threatens to break up NATO, holds Elon Musk responsible for massive layoffs in the government, and at the same time, buys himself a new Tesla and brags about it as the stock market crashes. The Dow Jones drops 850 points. The Nasdaq is down 3.1%. Everything from Apple stock to the retirement funds of millions of Americans. But that's not all. Canada is moving on. It's renegotiating its biggest military deal with the US, probably dumping the F-35 in favor of the Swedish Gripen. And Portugal, Germany, Europe as a whole. The EU is launching the €800 billion RAM Europe program to finally get rid of dependence on American weapons. The US is not only losing power, it's losing allies, it's losing credibility. What happens next? Will Canada back out of contracts under pressure from Trump? Will the US economy survive this energy shock? And will this be the beginning of the ending of US strategic leadership? Today we'll cover the biggest energy and geopolitical reversal of recent years. This is not just a conflict between two countries. It is a redistribution of the world, and perhaps you are its witnesses.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns, tonight saying he has the right to change course.
When Canada decided to suspend oil and gas shipments to the US, no one expected this turn of events. It was a moment that tipped the balance of power in the global energy arena. The cumulative damage to the US economy totaled $103.3 billion. These are not just numbers, they are the destruction of the familiar economic system on which the US had built its prosperity over the past decades. Canada, as the largest supplier of oil to the States, has not only stopped exporting, but has done so with the express purpose of sending a signal that they will no longer comply. US energy dependence on Canada had long been obvious, but like most US policies, this dependence was taken as a given, requiring little effort to maintain. Canadian oil supplies, especially from Alberta, accounted for nearly 40% of all US oil imports. And if someone in Washington could have predicted that this dependence would become a weapon in Canada's hands, Economists and politicians would probably have been more prepared for such a development. But Canada didn't. At some point, they decided that their country had all the resources to break free from the shadow of the US, so they sprang into action. Cutting off oil supplies at a time when the US economy was on the verge of overheating was the catalyst for a price shock that was felt by everyone from ordinary Americans paying for gasoline at gas stations to corporations dependent on cheap fuel. The price of oil and gas doubled, and gasoline jumped to a record $6 a gallon in some states, which not only made everyday life difficult, but also led to mass protests. But this was only the first stage of the big game. Canada didn't just stop oil and gas shipments to the US. It focused its efforts on building a strategic energy alliance with Asia and Europe, as well as potential new partners like China and India. These countries, unlike the US, had long sought stable energy sources, and Canada, with its vast hydrocarbon reserves, could not miss the chance. So Canada signed long-term contracts with these powers for decades to come. As a result, in a matter of months, Canada effectively replaced the US as an energy giant in the eyes of the world markets. China, which had increased its energy needs on the back of economic growth, could now count on a steady supply of oil and gas, as could India as it sought to grow its industry and consumer market.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
These agreements with Asia and Europe were a blow to the US, as it not only lost its main source of energy, but also opened the way for new players in the global energy market. Europe, realizing the risks of losing access to Russian gas, turned its eyes to Canada. Germany, France, and Great Britain began to sign long-term contracts for Canadian oil and gas supplies, which gave Canada a real chance to take a strong position in the European market. But most interestingly, Canada has significantly increased its supply to Asia. China, as the largest importer of oil, and India, eager to accelerate industrialization, could now count on supplies that had previously been available only to the United States. These changes created a whole wave of shifts in global energy policy. The US, having lost a stable supply of energy, now had to seek alternative sources. But this was not easy, given rising oil and gas prices and changes in the geopolitical arena, where their competitors, such as China and Russia, now had every chance to strengthen their position. It soon became apparent that the United States was in a vulnerable position. Their dependence on Canadian energy was the weak link that now hit the entire economy. Within a month of cutting off supplies, the US found itself on the brink of an energy crisis, and experts warned that unless an immediate solution was found, the consequences could be catastrophic for the entire country. When the US failed to respond to the threat in a timely manner, Canada strengthened its ties with other world powers, which jeopardized US strategic interests, not only in energy but in other areas as well. The economic sanctions that the US tried to impose on Canada only added to the tension, because in response, Canada began imposing its own tariffs, which hit US industry. Eventually, economic relations between the two countries began to break down, and this signaled to the world that the global energy arena was changing and the US could no longer remain as the untouchable leader.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
Washington was now faced with a difficult choice: either make a deal with Canada, trying to retain some influence over its energy market, or continue in an escalation. risking losing everything. America was trapped by its own sanctions, and its lack of willingness to respond to Canada's threats in a timely manner was a fatal mistake that now determines not only the country's energy security, but also its economic future. When the political situation between the US and Canada reached its peak, the escalation entered a whole new stage. After Canada made a move that plunged the US into an energy crisis, Washington was forced to react. But this time the situation was not so simple. Trump, losing control of the situation, became increasingly vocal about the need to punish Canada. He announced that he would impose a 100% tariff on Canadian cars if Canada did not stop the migration problem at the northern border. This threat was not just a political gesture. Trump was willing to use economic force to restore US influence over Canada. The conflict between the two neighbors had gone too far. No one expected that Canada would manage to take its economy to the international market at such a moment, depriving the US of a strategic energy supply partner. However, such measures in response to Trump's threats were made possible precisely because of the support of Canadian politicians, as well as the growing patriotism among the population. Society in Canada suddenly realized that they no longer had to submit to the economic dictates of the US, and threats such as the imposition of 100% tariffs on cars were seen as a move that could change the balance of power in the region forever.
Including Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon. President Trump with the Irish Prime Minister visiting the White House today. The president suggesting his tariffs won't stop here, saying, of course, I'm going to respond. And tonight, right here, the new poll showing 56% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the economy. The number's even worse now on the president's tariffs. ABC's chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce, leading us off.
Today, President Trump side by side in the Oval Office with the head of the Irish government.
But that was just the beginning. The Canadian government decided to react decisively and in response to the economic threats from the US to introduce its own retaliatory tariffs. The first phase was a $30 billion increase in tariffs, affecting goods such as food, clothing, and household goods that are an essential part of American life. This decision led to quite a shock among US citizens, who soon experienced a sharp rise in the prices of basic goods. Businesses began to ramp up their spending and the prices of goods, including groceries, skyrocketed. This move, however, proved to be only a prelude to a stronger response. The second wave of tariffs was far more severe. It targeted strategically important sectors of the US economy, such as automobiles, steel and aluminum, and agriculture. The Canadian economy became primarily targeted to hit the US auto industry, especially electric car manufacturers such as Tesla and General Motors, which depended on Canadian components. On top of that, new tariffs on steel and aluminum brought down US factories that relied on cheap Canadian materials to make their products. Economic experts predicted that these measures could worsen the country's economic situation to the point of curbing manufacturing growth and job losses. Canada also began strategizing to regain its position in the automotive market. By working with Europe, Canada has been able to find new channels to supply automotive components by bypassing the US. Expectations that Canada could become a major supplier of components to Europe were far from exaggerated. Europe, which is increasingly moving away from dependence on Chinese supplies, has embarked on a path of diversification, and Canada was in an advantageous position to offer European automakers low prices and high quality.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
Meanwhile, the US began to feel a real threat, not only economically but also politically. The Canadian authorities, having strengthened their economic position, began to actively seek new ways to protect their national interests. Talks about military and political independence from the United States became not just political rhetoric, but a real strategic policy in Canada. One of the steps was to reconsider participation in the F-35 program, where Canada had already ordered the first 16 aircraft, but now it was decided to renegotiate the contract for the purchase of 88 combat aircraft. Politicians, seeing the threat of increased American pressure, began to consider alternatives such as the Swedish Gripen, which would mean abandoning close defense cooperation with the US. Interestingly, at this point, NATO countries, including Portugal, also began to renegotiate their military agreements with the US. Portugal was cancelling the purchase of F-35s and stated that there was a need for a review of US policies that could destabilize the alliance. This view was echoed elsewhere in Europe, prompting serious reflection on the future of the US role in NATO. Canada, given its historical experience and independence, also did not want to depend on American leadership in the military sphere. This called into question the US strategic goal of maintaining US dominance in NATO and Western military security. The conundrum was that, despite Trump's pressure, Canada managed to build a strong international support network. Europe was not left behind. The EU announced its intention to strengthen its defense capabilities and reduce its dependence on the US by investing 800 billion euros in the REARM Europe program. This signaled to the US that its strategic alliance with Europe was beginning to lose strength. Europe was ready to make a move toward greater military sovereignty, which was another threat to the US position as a global leader. Canada, wasting no time, contracted with Germany to bolster its defense interests. In response to Trump's threats, Canadian politicians began seriously discussing the possibility of buying new weapons, including modernizing the Navy and expanding production of its own military technology. This reflected Canada's growing independence, which increasingly relied less and less on Washington, despite the historic friendship and partnership between the two countries. Thus, escalating tensions between the US and Canada not only destroyed bilateral economic ties, but also jeopardized the future of the true strategic alliance. The Canadian actions have shown that America is no longer the immutable leader, and other countries, including Europe and China, are ready to take a role in leading the world's economic and political processes. As for the US, it found itself in a situation where its dominance on the world stage became increasingly questionable. With the US economy on the brink of energy collapse and political tensions between the US and Canada continuing to rise, anything that could have calmed the tide of chaos seemed to disappear. Donald Trump's press conference was the culmination of this crisis. Instead of assuring the nation that the US would find a way out, Trump only exacerbated the problems, creating even more anxiety among citizens and international partners. This summit discussed the creation of new trade agreements aimed at reducing tariffs and simplifying procedures for companies that are affected by the new duties. An important point was that many analysts believed that more flexible terms for business communities could reduce the overall economic damage and return normal growth rates to the global economy. Despite all attempts to negotiate, most countries maintained strong positions. The EU continued to protect the interests of its manufacturers, especially in the automotive sector, where the US and Europe represented the greatest economic interests. However, it also became clear in Europe that local manufacturers could be in a much more vulnerable position if the US increased pressure. Over time, European policymakers began to more actively seek compromises to not only preserve trade relations with the US, but also to strengthen their position in Asian countries. It was proposed to expand the production of environmentally friendly cars, which could be a new competitive advantage in the global market. As the trade war continued to escalate, more countries began to realize that continued conflict could lead to global economic instability. Additional economic measures were introduced, such as tax cuts for large corporations and the creation of new market areas that would avoid undue pressure from duties. However, these steps could not completely eliminate economic tensions. Amid the economic crisis resulting from the trade war, questions were also raised about the possible withdrawal of countries from international trade organizations, such as the World Trade Organization. Some analysts have said that such action could lead to a profound reorganization of all international trade, leading to more political instability. What is the bottom line? How will events develop in the future? Many experts and political analysts are inclined to believe that this conflict will not be resolved quickly. The trade war is likely to drag on for several years, and during this time the US, EU, and Canada will continue to seek new forms of compromise, but only at the highest levels. Time will tell whether the parties will be able to find solutions that will help restore stability to international markets. However, one thing is certain. The consequences of this conflict will be felt for a long time to come, and every new economic decision made by the major powers will have far-reaching consequences for the entire world.